We are recording.
All right. Oh, hold on. Sorry, I'm just trying to make sure that I'm not getting reverb on my iPad. Okay. Welcome, everyone. This is the April 29th, 2024 Affordable Housing Committee Project Development Subcommittee Special Meeting, starting at 7:02 p.m. Let's go ahead and do the roll call. And I'm just going to pause for a second. Okay. Krista Nielsen, present. Hillary Ormond. Here. Bill Perrett. No. Mike Sweeney.
Here.
And Jane Williams.
Here.
All right. And then we also have Jeff Williams and John Goodwin from the Affordable Housing Committee in attendance. Okay, so I wanted to just do a little quick recap of where I thought we left off last time. We talked about a lot of things, and so I just wanted to make sure that we're all on the same page. I had three main takeaways. The first was that we wanted to talk to Rick Ross, whose face we see up there on the screen from Westmount, to hear more about, yeah, I see him, more about the need, well, to hear about affordable housing development in general, but more specifically about the demographic need that they're seeing at Canaan Parish and at Millport, so that we have an idea of what the need is for a future affordable housing development project. Secondly, we had a question last time about queue points, and basically, could we come up with a best case, worst case scenario of how many queue points we were going to need, depending on how the moratorium lawsuit, the 830G lawsuits play out. And so that's the second thing on the agenda. And then the third thing, which is our main focus that we talked about, was doing some initial GIS work to come up with a list of potential properties that we could then hone down and refine and come up with some criteria to start to figure out which might be options for us to consider in the future. And so I have some initial data on that tonight. Hopefully you guys will have some reactions to it, and I can go back and work with Ty and Bond, who is the town's GIS consultant, to further refine it and get us more what we need. But I think we have something to at least start with. So that's the agenda for this evening. We will take public comment at the end, as we always do, and then we'll end with figuring out what our next steps are and when we're going to meet again. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Mr. Ross to our meeting. And Bob, if we could take him off of, oh, he took himself off of mute, so that we can hear from him a little bit. He took himself off, I see that.
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Great. Hi, everybody. How are you? I'm Rick Ross. I'm the Vice President of Westmount Management. We are the property management company that manages the Millport property and Canaan Parish. And we also do affordable housing development through our development arm, Westmount Development Group. And Jane and Krista asked me to come on tonight to talk a little bit about the experience that we've had with Millport and with Canaan Parish, in particular Canaan Parish, with the new development and the addition of units there, and the type of demand that we're seeing. And then generally to, I suppose, field questions about affordable housing development to the extent that I can, and offer whatever might be of value to you. So as you probably are aware, Millport is 113 units and Canaan Parish is 100 units, so a total of 213. And I would say that Well, both properties are set up as family developments, meaning there is not a preference for elderly or other subsections of the population. So that means that anyone can apply, regardless of age or familial status. And the majority of the residents at both properties are in the family category. So the demand ranges in terms of bedroom sizes from 1, 2s, 3s, all the way up to 4s. And in age group, really, we see a range from people in their 20s to people, literally, we have a 102-year-old resident at Canaan Parish now, maybe actually 103. So the use is broad and the demand is pretty strong. And at both properties, you have two types of affordable units available. One type, well, 100% of both properties are what's called tax credit properties. So they're funded in large part by low-income housing tax credits. So that program blankets 100% of the units at both properties. And then overlaid on top of that, at Canaan Parish, 60 of the 100 units are overlaid with a Section 8 contract that covers the units that were the original Canaan Parish that have now been replaced with the new units. And then you have 18 Section 8 units out of the 113 at Millport. And without question, the demand for units that carry Section 8 is endless. And the reason for that, of course, is that the way the Section 8 program works is someone presents, as long as their annual income is below the threshold, the rent that the tenant pays is a formula that equates to roughly 30% of their annual income. And the difference between that and the total rent is picked up by the Section 8 program. So it provides tenants a wide range of incomes that can qualify for the unit, and also gives them some protection. As their income might adjust over time, their rent will adjust accordingly. In a tax credit unit, the demand isn't as strong as Section 8 because you don't have that subsidy program attached to it, but it's still extremely strong. And we've managed to fill all the Canaan Parish units in a matter of months. But the program works a little bit differently when you have just straight tax credit. There, what you do is you set aside units at different bands of income. So you look at the area median income, and the standard is 60% of the area median income. So we look for residents whose incomes are below 60%, but typically above about 45% of the area median income, which allows us a range to rent to folks, but ensures that the folks that we're renting to have the capacity to make the rent and not, get in a situation where rent becomes a burden to them. So in both cases, the demand is very strong, but Section 8 will always outstrip tax credit because of the rental subsidy. And I would say we field no fewer than 4 to 5 inquiries a week for the properties, Canaan Parish and Millport. And certainly with the construction of the new Canaan Parish, those inquiries increased because people saw those buildings go up, and they're obviously quite nice. And so that's definitely spurred demand for the units and for what's available. And then I would also offer that, folks that live in the properties, majority are working folks, working in various jobs in various capacities. We definitely have some elderly at Canaan Parish that were a part of what I'll call the legacy units, the units that were there previously that have been there for, in some cases, decades. And the Section 8 allows for that to happen. It allows for someone to transition from working to retirement. Again, because that the portion of the rent that the tenant will be responsible for fluctuates by virtue of the program. So I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought there. So I would say that the demand is very strong, and certainly the demand for affordable housing in New Canaan is strong because you have a strong school system, and because it is so expensive to live in that part of the state, not just New Canaan, but that part of the state. There definitely is significant demand for the units, more than we can accommodate, and so we run wait lists at both properties. So, as I'm talking here, just feel free to ask me any type of questions you might have as to the process of either the management or the development of it. But in my conversations prior to this, it's my understanding that, and hearing what your agenda is, it's my understanding that you're actively looking to expand the affordable housing offerings in town, and what I could offer in terms of thoughts as to how best to do that would be to first look for sites that have a combination of proximity to public transportation. That's a very hot button within the state, and I would also encourage you to look at sites that are easily developed from a site perspective, meaning utilities available, whether they be water or sewer or gas. Having those utilities in the road at sites, makes development significantly easier. And then I would also offer that if you have properties that you think are convertible or are already residential, some of the low-hanging fruit would be to try and find existing buildings where you could make a different use, convert them to residential or refurbish them for residential purposes. Again, it kind of clears a lot of hurdles that you can run into, not just with affordable housing, but with development in general. But in particular, affordable housing, because the funding sources like the concept of reusing existing buildings, repurposing them, and it also, can cut down on time to start and also cost when you have a building that can be repurposed. Now, not all buildings that can be repurposed would be appropriate. That's more of a architectural and engineering pursuit, but those are the types of things that I would be thinking about if I were in your shoes. And then, kind of anecdotally, one of the things that I'm starting to hear rumblings about is that for the past 20 to 25 years, the funding focus by virtue of policy has been to fund family housing, and that remains the focus. But I'm starting to see questions come up about, okay, so we've focused funding for 25 years on family housing to the disadvantage of elderly housing. So I'm starting to hear some rumblings about that in terms of trying to reincorporate elderly housing into the funding narrative and the funding direction from both the state and the federal level. So that would be the other thing that I would consider is, family housing certainly has a huge demand, but so does elderly. And so, thinking about affordable housing from those two demographics, I think is worthwhile. It doesn't have to just be family.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ross. I apologize, I didn't give you more of a overview up front, but yes, this is a subcommittee of the larger Affordable Housing Committee that is tasked with trying to identify some sites that could be appropriate for future affordable housing.
Sure.
A couple of questions I have for you, and then I'm sure the other commissioners have questions as well. Does Westmount have any sort of canned demographic data? Obviously, I'm not looking for anything person specific, but about, these are the income levels of the units. These are the types of units, that income level matches with, so that we could have more insight into exactly what need is being met at Canaan Parish and Millport.
Yes, we do. We have, I don't have that data off the top of my head, but yes, we have reports that I can show you the types of units that and the income bands that we're servicing with those units. Generally speaking, I would say, on the straight tax credit unit side, 90+% are in the 45% to 60% AMI band. And then when you get into the Section 8 units, that band widens from all the way from literally 0 to 80% of the area median income. So you have a much wider range on the Section 8 side of the equation than you do with tax credit. But tax credit, Section 8 vouchers are very difficult to get. And so if I were in your position, I would be thinking primarily about the tax credit side of the equation. And so
Really, I guess the virtue that
the band that I would be looking at would be the 45 to 60% of AMI band.
I mean, it's been out there a few days and it's been very, very
we got a little
pleasantly received.
Yeah, hold on a sec.
background noise there.
I'm sorry, can you just say that one more time? The band you would focus on was
The
45
band,
to
the band what I would be focusing on would be the 45 to 60% AMI band. And,
Okay.
the secondary reason for that is that when you start to look at the more deeply skewed bands, and what I mean by that is the 50%, 25 to 50% or 0 to 25% of area median income bands, you have to have a corresponding rent that equates to those income amounts. So the amount of debt that you are able to take on in a property by virtue of the income reduces as you move down those bands, those income bands. And so it gets significantly more difficult to get a deal to pencil out as you move down those income bands. So as you move lower in the AMI schedule, what winds up happening is you have to find additional funding sources to fill the gaps that are created by that reduced rent. And of course, as you reduce the rent, the demand gets very significant because there are a lot of folks who live at or below those area median incomes, but it gets, as I said, increasingly more difficult to make a deal work when you're reducing your income down by that amount, because you just simply don't produce enough to take on enough debt plus tax credits plus any other sources that you can put together to make a deal work. I don't know if you want me to get into the typical funding sources, 4% versus 9% tax credits and what have you, that can get a little technical. I'm not sure that you're interested in that. If you are, I'd be happy to. But
we have another subcommittee that is focused more on the financing, so I think we'll leave that for another day. But we may ask you later.
So I think the key takeaway for you would be that you have even at the 45 to 60% of area median income band, you have a very large demand, more than we can accommodate at both Canaan Parish and Millport.
And so if you were to perhaps build another project in New Canaan to meet that band of income, what type of, like, in terms of unit composition, are we talking 2 bedrooms? Like, what kind of units would you be considering to build to meet that?
So on the, assuming it would be a family-oriented development, we have the easiest time renting the 2s and 3s. We have a harder time renting the 1s.
Okay. But I'm assuming if we went towards an elderly or senior model that you were talking about earlier, that would probably be more 1 bedroom.
That would shift. Yeah, that would be, I would think you would want to do something like a 70-30, even the 80-20, 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom type of mix.
Okay.
Again, that gets into not just demand, but that at that point you kind of want to move the cube a little bit to see what gives you the most favorable income profile between the 1s and the 2s and the rents that those produce to make a deal work.
Okay. Other questions for Mr. Ross?
Rick, after the board meeting Wednesday, we had a discussion with Chandrita, and she was going to update that deck that she put together for the board that reviewed the size of the units and the income for the Section 8 and for the low-income housing tax credit. So I think if we provide that to this subcommittee, I think it'd be incredibly helpful.
Yeah, sure. That's not a problem. We can redact the, the family information off of there and provide you a report that shows you what AMI set aside each unit is at, because the way you do it, of course, is you assign the set asides to the units, and then you fill them with families that qualify for those units. So we can show you that that mix with a report that we can produce from our property management software. Sure, that's not a problem.
Rick, hi, it's Jane. Thank you for being here. I do have a question. Based on your talking about proximity to transit, when we were on the phone, you also talked a little bit about proximity to town and how, for example, Canaan Parish, we were out there, some of us looking at it today, would not really be considered walkable. Can you talk a little bit about your experience with in-town housing, the concept and numbers of cars and so on, and whether those are issues we ought to be factoring in from the start?
Yeah, sure. Certainly proximity to public transportation is a benefit for the resident. I apologize, that's my, can you grab him, please? Sorry about that. Certainly proximity to public transportation is a benefit. And I would say that it certainly makes it easier for folks to get to jobs and all of the things that you would normally think would happen with public transportation. And it's also very nice, especially if you start to think about an elderly population for a property. Proximity to town then becomes, I think, even more valuable. The ability to walk to town to get a coffee or get lunch or breakfast or whatever it might be is very valuable. And so, I would encourage those, any site consideration, the closer to town, the better, in my opinion. And or proximity to either schools or public parks. So to give you an example, we have a development in New Haven that is built on either side of a K through 8 school. And there are majority 3 and 4 bedroom units. So it's all family focused housing. And it gives the kids an opportunity to literally walk across the street to go to school. And so those types of locations, I think, work well and are very valuable. So to reiterate, elderly population, definitely close to town is beneficial. Family population, either proximate to schools or public parks or close to town. If you could accomplish both, then, that's, in terms of location, that's kind of the holy grail, in my opinion.
Thank you.
Hey, Rick. Mike Sweeney here. How are you?
Good, Mike. How are you?
Thanks. Refresh me. I think at Millport, are we just a tad under one space per unit? And maybe you could speak about the challenges we have with parking and the complaints we have there. Probably that's one of the hot topics at every meeting that we have every month. And that's on a 1-for-1 ratio. Yeah.
In Millport's a family development, so we have families with multiple cars, but we don't have multiple spaces for every unit. So parking can be a challenge there. And, I think that's why, one of the reasons why I'm, kind of pushing and focusing a little bit on the TOD, the transit oriented development concept, because parking can be a challenge in these developments. And it's a delicate balance between creating density that allows a deal to work and creating parking that allows for comfortable living or ample parking spaces for residents. And so to the extent that you can eliminate the need for multiple vehicles in a family, you create the opportunity for a little more density on the development, which in turn creates a better opportunity to actually build something, because you're as you probably know, the more density, the more likely to be able to do a deal. Canaan Parish, has quite a bit of parking actually, and so we haven't run into the same issue there. But it is definitely a hot button target, especially especially on sites where creating density is required.
Do you know off the top of your head what the parking ratio is at Millport? I mean, I'm sure we can look into it, but you do.
Millport's about 1-to-1, one space per unit.
1-to-1. Okay.
Yeah, and at Canaan Parish, it's probably almost 1.5-to-1. It might even be a little bit more than 1.5. Try to remember the full count. It might be up into the 160s for parking spaces there for the 100 units.
Great. Other questions?
Could you talk just maybe in broad strokes about financing and how Millport or Canaan Parish, how it's carried on a year-to-year basis? We had someone speak to us, Art Cassivan, who I know you know, explain to us the funding sources and the 4% tax credits, the money from the town, and how we put the budget together to construct units. But maybe just in broad strokes, how each complex is carried from year to year, reserves that are put aside, for future repairs that have to be made, capital improvements, but also the big item, which is land. And if we didn't have the free land, whether we could have come anywhere near what we did with either of the projects.
Yeah, so I would say you're absolutely right. Without the free land, it would have been very difficult to do what you have out there today. It would have been some dialed down version of what you see there. So to the extent that you can eliminate expenses from the development process, obviously it gives you more opportunity to build more units. So kind of the standard would be land, taxes, so tax abatements are very important. And then adding tax credits, whether they be 4% or 9% tax credits. 9% are very difficult to get, competitive. 4%, not as difficult, but don't produce as much equity to bring into the deal. So you wind up having to get additional sources. Canaan Parish was fortunate in that it kind of timed the market just right, where they hit literally the bottom of the interest rate market. So the amount of borrowing that was available to them was significant as compared to what you would get today at the rates that we're looking at. So that certainly helped significantly. But without the land that Canaan Parish had and the tax abatement that was put in place for Canaan Parish, wouldn't look or be the way it is. It would be something smaller than that, and would have had a very different outcome. So those contributions from the town are very valuable towards being able to create a development. And then, of course, one of the most valuable things is your income profile, meaning the rents that you're able to charge. And so when you start putting those things together, it kind of informs what kind of deal you can do in terms of number of units, complexity of development, type of development. But those three things are particularly key. Did I answer your question, Mike?
Yes, you did. Thanks, Rick. I
Great.
think the point I was getting into not very well was that even with all the subsidies from the town and the funding sources, and the loans that were received, the grants, the loans at rock bottom, it still just carries itself. There aren't large sums of money that are generated year to year to fund new projects or to think about, big capital improvements that we just get by, on our
Correct.
covenant with the bank.
Yeah, that's correct. Yes. And I'm sorry, I didn't answer your question about the reserves. So at the closings of these deals, typically your lender and or equity provider or both will require a fairly significant contribution to a reserve account. And that reserve account is usually an operating reserve. And then throughout the course of operation on an annual basis, you're required to put money into replacement reserves. And it typically starts off at anywhere from $300 to $450 per unit per year, and then as time goes on, those numbers increase to accommodate future repair needs that the property has, which would be a little bit different than a capital improvement. Although you can use those funds for capital improvements as well. But yeah, the deals are designed to provide quality, affordable housing to be stable, but they're not designed to be windfalls. They're just not set up that way.
Thanks, Rick.
Sure.
Yeah, come on over. Mr. Goodwin, who's the chair of the overall Affordable Housing Committee, has a couple questions for you too. So he's joining
Sure.
us.
Thank you. Hey, Rick, how are you?
I'm well, how are you?
Good, thank you. For repurposing, are you generally able to get access to the same types of financing, for example, the 4% tax credits and the like? I mean, are there any limitations if you're, say, buying a building?
No, yes, you absolutely can get access to the same types.
Okay, great. And then second question, Rick, is so, a village like New Canaan, fairly small place. I mean, any thoughts on, let's say you're doing a fairly significant project, but, a small town, any thoughts on how do you try to put those two things together?
You mean in terms of
I mean, in terms of how you would go about the development, how you would think about developing it.
I think I would follow the blueprint of either Millport or Canaan Parish. That's kind of the roadmap, the way those were done. Both used low-income housing tax credits, which I think would be likely a necessity for you. I think it's always important in any town, small or large, to get buy-in by the local population. So, I think siting it becomes important, making sure that you're siting it in such a way that you're trying to limit infringement on, whether it be single family homes or whether it be resources that that might be taxed as a result of the housing. But generally speaking, I think I'll give you an example. So down the street from my home, about a mile away, I live in Brantford, so it's a relatively small town, about 30,000 residents. We had an aging affordable housing development that had 60 units in it, and 40 units in it. And they replaced it with, much like what you did at Canaan Parish, they replaced it with about 70 new units. So they almost doubled the unit count there. And there was, fairly significant pushback from the neighborhood on the property and the redevelopment. But now that it's completed, I'm not hearing a lot. And so I think if you are considerate of scale and things like site lighting and parking, and you know, these things might seem a little scary up front, but really are not once you actually get them built and get them in place, and everything kind of falls into the normal function of daily life. So, you know, I think being considerate of the location and those around that location is important. And aside from that, you know, I think you kind of got to put a deal together that works. You know, you can't always have everything that you want in an affordable housing deal. Something's got to give somewhere along the line. So a deal that works, that's as considerate as it can be, is about the best you can hope for, and you work with that. And you know, New Canaan's not unique in terms of you know, its need for affordable housing and trying to figure out what to do. You know, I got a call just the other day from the exact same commission in my town to do exactly what I'm doing with you, because they're trying to figure it out also. There's really no special sauce to it. It's really just finding locations that can work financially, that you think that the townspeople can buy into. And if you could put those two things together, you know, you got a deal that works.
Rick, one last question. Is it typically the projects you're doing, are they typically 100% quote unquote affordable housing? Or do you also do projects where it's not 100%?
Well, it depends on the type of funding. So in the case of a 9% tax credit deal, which is a competitive funding round, those you mix affordable and market rate. So the deal we're doing now, that's a 9% deal, is 80% affordable, 20% market rate. And the reason for that is the policy requires that in order to get the funding. In a 4% deal, no, it's typically 100% affordable units with no market rate. And the reason for that is that usually when you balance the equity that you get from tax credits versus the rent that you could get from a market rate unit, the equity will win out in terms of the production of dollars. It's something that you can look at on every deal to be sure of that, but mostly that is the case, where, you know, doing 100% affordable will yield more dollars than a blend.
Thank you.
So Rick,
Sure.
this is Jeff Williams. I had a couple of questions.
Turn your mic on.
I had a couple of questions. We have at Canaan Parish, you have probably a Section 8 situation you couldn't replicate. But could you give us a little bit of a sense? Is there a notable difference in the rent paid by the Section 8 occupants versus the tax credit occupants in that location?
So the rent paid by the residents doesn't necessarily have a notable difference. Well, let me rephrase that. So on the Section 8 side, the amount that the resident pays is a function of their income. On the tax credit side, the amount of rent that is charged is a function of the area median income band that unit is set aside for. So you might have a Section 8 unit that's in the 60% area median income band that has Section 8 on top of it, and the resident pays $100 a month. And then in that same unit could be, you know, in the next building over, you have a 60% area median income band tax credit unit without Section 8, and that resident could be paying $1,500 a month.
And in each of those cases, what's the realization by the property?
So in total rent, the Section 8 rent delivers significantly more rent than the tax credit does. So in the case of the Section 8 rent, if the tax credit's delivering $1,500, the Section 8 rent there is delivering more like $3,000 to $3,200.
Thank you.
And, you know, and just conceptually, the reason for that is that the way tax credit work is that you as the owner, developer, are getting your tax credits up front. You're using that money to build the building, and your give back is to reduce the rents. In a Section 8 world, you're doing it kind of in reverse. You're getting the Section 8 to produce income enough to borrow enough to do a deal, but you're not getting an equity infusion like you do when you sell tax credits. So
Yeah.
it's two sides of an equation. And then in cases like Canaan Parish, you're able to layer the two, and that's what really supercharges a deal.
Then a second question, you had mentioned that there's a bias towards transportation-oriented development.
Mhm.
You hear a lot about that and you also hear that the state has a preference for that, a bias, I think is what I've heard, a bias towards that kind of development. Is there any real benefits that the state imparts to the developer who does a development in a or a transportation-oriented situation?
Yes. In the case of a 9% tax credit deal, you typically will get points for being in a TOD. In the case of a 4% tax credit deal, not so much, no. But when you start to look for additional funding sources, which are often needed in a 4% tax credit deal, the additional funding sources from places like the Department of Housing and or, for example, CHFA debt sources, those sources will place a premium on transit-oriented developments.
Okay, thank you. That's what I was wondering.
One point of clarification. So are all of the Section 8 units legacy units? So at Millport and at Canaan Parish, or have we had any new Section 8 vouchers since Canaan Parish was built or Millport was redone?
No, they're all legacy units that were carried over. So in the case of Millport, they were the units that replaced the public housing units that were there previously. And in the case of Canaan Parish, it was the original 60 had a Section 8 contract that carried over to the new building. And the way they built it was they did 60 units first and then 40 units in the second building. And so those 60 unit project-based carried over. So no new or additional project-based vouchers. We do have residents who come with housing choice vouchers, which belong to the resident and they can choose to go wherever they want with it. So we do have some folks like that, but project-based that belong to the project, no.
Okay.
You
Thanks.
know, there's one other thing out there that just popped into my mind. There's a new concept about middle income housing. And middle income housing is generally defined as units designed for the 80% to 120% AMI category. And CHFA has recently come out with a debt product that is geared towards that middle income housing. That would be another thing to consider. It's relatively new. I'm sure there are deals in the works that use it, but I haven't seen one yet. So I don't really know what the profile of a deal like that looks like. But that is one of the latest and greatest products that CHFA has available.
Would those be eligible for 830G count?
I don't know the answer to that. It's so new. I'm not sure.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Mr. Ross, for coming to our meeting this evening. I'm sure we
Sure.
will probably follow up with more questions at some point, but I think this was a great start. So thank you for your time.
Sure, and I'll be sure to email you that it's basically an occupancy report that will show you kind of the breakdown of the units at both Millport and Canaan Parish.
Right. That would be great.
All right. All right. Thank you very much, everybody. I appreciate it.
All
Thank
right,
you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Nice.
Night.
Okay, so item number 3 on our agenda was, or item number 4, sorry, is to discuss this sort of best worst case scenario of Q point calculations. I'm asking Mr. Mantillo, who's helping us out this evening, if he can share the screen, because when I do it, I get all this feedback that's messing with my brain. But for those of us in the room right now, I've handed out, and I have one more copy, I think. Or maybe not.
You might have given it to me.
Okay, I don't have any more copies. We'll try and get it on the screen.
Did it get sent to us?
I emailed it to everyone, yeah.
Giacomo, would you like this? And I'll pull it up on my iPad.
Anyway, we will,
Did you get it?
Do you have another one? Don't worry about it. It's a jackal. I have it on my computer.
Yeah,
Okay.
I figured.
well, for those of you on Zoom, we will attempt to get this up on the screen momentarily. For those of you in the room that have a copy, I hope you brought your magnifying glasses because the print is very small. But this paper that I've handed out and that we'll hopefully see in a minute has two sides to it. I was going to go over the smaller print side first that talks about how Hugh points are calculated and what's out there. So on the top left corner, and just for the record, this front side was made by Sarah Carey, the town planner, who also helped prepare the town's most recent moratorium application. So that's where this data is coming from. The top left box goes through the different number of Hugh points you get for different types of units. And as you can see here, unit size plays a factor in this. So for instance, 1 and 2 bedrooms get less Hugh points than 3 bedrooms. 3 bedrooms seem to garner more. Rentals get more Hugh points than owner occupied units. And then the more deeply affordable a project is, generally the more Hugh points it gets as well. There we go. Could you zoom in just a little bit, Bob, so the people on Zoom might have a chance of reading this? There you go. We're on the top left. Yeah, that'll be good for now.
And so SMI, just to be clear, is state median income. So we talked.
Yes, it is.
We've talked about area. Is there a difference between area median income and state median income?
Yes.
Right.
Okay, so yes, the way the statute for 830G reads is that it's the lesser of area median income or state median income. And so here, because our incomes are so high, state median income will always be the lesser. So that's what we go off of. And so to answer your earlier question, Mr. Williams, for getting moratorium points, we have to use state median income. We can go up to 80% of area median income to count for units that count towards the 10% of this housing stock, but those units won't count towards a future moratorium.
So for our purposes, we're really looking at the 60% state median income unit or payment, right?
So we can go up to 80% of state median
Oh,
income.
you can go to 60 to 80.
Yeah, so that if you
To
can read on
qualify
this,
for the moratorium.
yeah, to
Okay.
qualify for the moratorium, you can have units up to 80% of state median income.
Oh, right.
I didn't know if you were referencing what we just heard from Mr. Ross, that we should be targeting a lower band, but yes, we can get points for that. And then down at the bottom of that chart on the top left, you can see that there is half a point for deed restricted to seniors. And also even market rate units in an 830G project also get a 1/4 of a point. So there's a couple of things that aren't technically, affordable per se, although I think senior affordable unit has to have some sort of income restriction on it as well.
So that's not an extra 0.5%. That's
All you get.
if
for
you
senior.
are affordable and senior.
Yeah.
You get a demerit essentially.
Yeah.
Right.
Hmm.
Which is, interesting to hear Mr. Ross talk about sort of a policy shift to focus more on providing units for elderly. I think that's a great thing, but so far
We don't see it.
this hasn't changed to support that,
Yeah.
right? So I mean, that's kind of how.
Points.
I think you would see it there, and I think you'd probably see it in the state's qualified plan in terms of how they award the low-income housing tax credits as well.
Yeah.
So then going across the top, the sort of second box up there that says unused Hugh points. So that what this is showing you is points and units in both Canaan Parish and Millport that the town has not applied towards a moratorium application. And so there's, what, 31 units in Millport that haven't been used towards a moratorium application, and currently 51 units in Canaan Parish, so half of Canaan Parish hasn't been used in a moratorium application. The significance of this is that that 31 units in Millport is what the lawsuit with the state over the most recent moratorium application is about. And depending on whether we prevail or not in that lawsuit, that will essentially dictate whether these units ever get used. So if we lose the lawsuit on the moratorium application, that's 81 units that essentially we paid for, we funded, we're providing great housing for low-income people, but we won't ever get credit for.
And that's because their certificate of occupancy was issued prior to when we filed our latest moratorium application, right? So the argument would be that if we lose that, our general argument on the moratorium, that we can use sort of stockpiled units that were, that had a CO before, then we would lose the credit of these 82. They would just be a wash and
Right,
out of consideration.
right. So that's what that's about. The boxes underneath that in yellow essentially say that same thing that I just said. Okay. So then of interest to you guys probably is the top far right box, if you can scroll over. And this goes through projects that have come through planning and zoning in various capacities that could garner Hugh points towards the next moratorium. The first three that you see there are the 3830G projects that came through last year. As I think we all know, those are all currently in litigation, but the value of this is to show you if we lost that litigation, how many Hugh points these projects would get. It also gives you, Sarah put a little time frame about when we might have answers on how these shake out. And generally the short answer is end of 2024, beginning of 2025 is kind of the time frame we're looking at. Yes.
In the development status box, 751, that's a sentence there. Could you explain what standing sewer challenges to the road construction? Is that in addition to the P&Z appeal?
Correct. So there's two different types of litigation going on the Weed Street property. And one of them is the fact that the town did not grant access, direct access extension of the sewer line for that property to connect to. So there's a lawsuit about that. And then there's also a lawsuit about the 830G application. At the bottom of that list, the fourth one that just is listed as Burtis, I think it was a year, maybe 2 years ago, we had an application for over here where 84 Sports used to be on Burtis and Cherry Street. 84 Sports, there's two older homes, and then basically a parking lot that backs up to Cherry Street, and I can't think of what that building is. I want to call it the telephone building, but it's the Frontier Building. So all of that land is under single ownership. They came through planning and zoning. If my memory serves correct, I think it was like a total of 26 units that they were going to build there, a small amount of retail, because it is a retail zone, so we do require that there be mixed use. And they were the first project the only project, but the first project that the Planning Zoning Commission approved using inclusionary zoning regulations. So they had to do a percentage of those units as affordable. And so it was only 26 units. So it came out to looks like three 1-bedroom rentals is what they came out to. So the thing with that project is that, as I understand it, the timeline's unclear. They came through, got approval, and then I think they sold the development rights to someone else. And so I don't know that. Oh, they still own it. Okay, yeah, so we're just, that could happen. It could get us 4.5 viewpoints, but there doesn't seem to be anything noticeable happening over there. So that's another one that's, a little bit uncertain, but it's not a ton of viewpoints. Okay, and then if you go down to the bottom two charts there on the same side of the page, the first one on the left that says various point scenarios to achieve a full moratorium. This is Sarah's attempt at kind of saying, if we did all 100% 3-bedroom rentals at 60% of SMI, we would only need to build 67 units. So she was trying to give us sort of the range of how many units we could be looking at. And if you look at the low end at 67, if we did 3-bedroom rentals, all at 60% SMI. At the high end, if we did 1-bedroom with seniors, it's 122. So, I mean, we've been saying all along that probably somewhere between 70 and 100 units is what's needed for the next project, depending on how you shake out these different variables here. And I think that this supports that that's still an accurate representation of what we're looking at. And then on the right, the who qualifies for these units, she's just giving us basically the income bands that each of these different categories fall into. And so that's, what we're looking at in terms of income. So to sum it all up on the second page, if you zoom back in and scroll down, Bob, I made this graphic that kind of shows you all the options of how this may play out. And the irony here is the ones that look good in terms of hue points are actually probably not the scenarios that the town is looking for. So sort of the least points we would ever need would be if we win the moratorium lawsuit, which means we get those 81 units at Canaan Parish and Millport back and can apply those. And we lose the 830G lawsuits, which means we get all of the points that potentially could come from Weed and Elm, Hill Street, and Main Street here. And if that were the situation, we would actually end up with 126 hue points ready to go. So we would, as Affordable Housing Committee, only really need to be looking at building like enough for 30 hue points, which is not going to be a whole lot of units. It might be 15 units. So, I mean, in that scenario, the sort of land banking option we've been talking about, where maybe we do a couple units here and a couple units there, that could work out. Certainly, I'm not sure that that's what the town wants, but I'm just, on paper, that one looks pretty enticing. The second one up from the bottom, losing the moratorium lawsuits and losing the 830G lawsuit. So in that scenario, we lose all those points for Canaan Parish and Millport that we haven't used. And we also then get the points for the 830G lawsuits. In that case, we are short. Yeah, we're short 5 hue points. It's not 5 units. So I mean, that's probably just, 2 or 3 units. So that's that scenario. Probably the ideal scenario is the third one up from the bottom, which is that we win the moratorium lawsuits and we win the 830G lawsuits. I think that's the politically and probably publicly most popular scenario, in which case we would only need 15 hue points towards a next moratorium. So, with all those points left, if we're able to use them from Canaan Parish and from Millport, we're actually pretty close to another moratorium. It's just a question of, will we get the ability to use those? And then if we're being the most conservative in terms of how we look at what type of project we're looking for, losing the moratorium lawsuits, which means you don't get any of the Canaan Parish Millport points, and winning the 830G lawsuits, which means we don't create any new affordable housing through those projects, would basically mean we need 146, let's call it 150 hue points, which gets you back to the 70 to 100 units. So I know that's a lot of information and kind of confusing, but
This is
hopefully.
super helpful. I find this to be incredibly
I
helpful.
agree.
And so that's kind of the spectrum. And like I said earlier, I mean, nobody has a crystal ball, but hopefully by the end of this year, early next year, we start to see where we fall on this chart so that we can set a better outlook. But I think for now, if we want to be the most conservative, which seems probably like the smartest way to go, we should assume we need 150 hue points.
Crystal, remind us what the best guess on resolution, or at least initial resolution of these two pieces of litigation is.
In terms of time?
Yeah.
end of this year, early next year. But I mean, that being,
In both cases.
in both cases, that being said, I'll let Mr. Sweeney chime in as a land use attorney, but these things can go on for a very long time.
Particularly if the losing side wants to appeal.
Right. So yeah, I would say end of this year, beginning of next year is probably the best case scenario and maybe a realistic scenario, but you know,
Is the 4.5 here, it just refresh, that's
that's the
Burtis?
Burtis.
Yeah, that's
And
what I
so in
thought.
all scenarios, I mean, I wasn't really factoring for whether that gets built or not. And it's such a small number of viewpoints that I didn't think it really swung the pendulum too far one way or another. So I just kept it in there, assuming it will get built.
On your last presentation here, the moratorium lawsuits were successful, but we lose on 830G.
Mhm.
Those are remaining points. That would be for the next moratorium.
Yeah.
Because we would have won the existing application.
Well, so we'd have one now through 2028,
Mhm.
and then we'd have 126 viewpoints.
There'd be a third.
Third one, yeah. Yeah. Just meaning we would have very little, we as a committee, if our sole goal is to just get the next moratorium in 2028, would have very little to have to build. But the town would pay a pretty hefty price for that in terms of some of the development that would happen. Okay.
And you can also play with these numbers if you want to game theory out the likelihood of us winning some 830Gs lawsuits and not all of them, but I think it's kind of safe to look at it as a package deal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the same.
And I mean, I think it gives you the range. I mean,
Sure.
that's really what
Yep.
we were trying to get to is what is the range? What's the least amount we'd have to build? What's the most we'd have to build in this? It's a big range. It's not, I'm not necessarily narrowing it down, but it at least gives you the ballpark that we're playing in.
And we'll know about the latest application for a moratorium in about 3 weeks, right?
Yeah, I think end of May is when a decision has to be rendered on that. I don't know the exact date offhand. 22nd. All right, everyone set your timers
Yeah.
for May 22nd. All right, let me see if I,
This is really helpful. Thank you for putting this.
Yeah.
You and Sarah for putting
Thank
this
you,
together.
Sarah, too.
I'm gonna send Bob now the next two things that I want up on the screen. So just, we're done with this. So let's give me 1 second.
When you post the minutes, it might be helpful to post the attachments too.
Okay.
So that they're available on the town website. And Tucker can help. Specifically, you reference them and do that. Just a
Okay.
thought.
Yeah, I think that's
It'd be
Great.
great to get all of this on the Affordable Housing Committee landing page.
Yes.
so on the
It's
planning
harder
and,
to find.
yeah, on planning and zoning, we have our material by each meeting. So maybe I'll talk to Tucker, but maybe there's a way that we can, say that
Have
whatever
video
today is,
link and-
the April 29th meeting, here's the materials, here's the video, here's the agenda. Okay, so I just sent some more stuff to Bob. Before I move on from this item, does anyone have other questions or data or information that's not on this table regarding Q points and potential scenarios that I need to follow up and collect for future meetings? Or is this good enough to go on for now?
I think it's great to go on for now, and I think that the only other thing that might be helpful is some calculation of minimum square footage by 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, or 3 bedrooms, so that we could know. I think the chart that says if we built all 3 bedrooms at 60% SMI, we need 67 of them. Well, how big of a project, acreage or whatever, however you measure it, does that equal? Because I
Mhm.
think then that gives you a really good idea, because obviously I'm like, well, let's build all 3 bedrooms. We only have to build 67 of them, but then that's a massive project.
Right.
I just have no idea about the square footage or things like that. So I think minimum square footage and even just adding that column of how much, I don't know how it's measured building footprint wise, whether it's acreage or,
Yeah.
right? Does that make sense?
It
Yeah.
does, and we could base it on what we already have in town.
Yeah.
When I got the impression from our meeting today at Canaan Parish that there's either through HUD or through the state's low income, that there's some sort of metric for that. Like
Yeah.
you can't just say we're going to build a 100
Yeah.
square foot 1 bedroom unit. Like there's a minimum
Yes,
somewhere. I don't know exactly where that comes from, but we'll have to.
that
check.
would be helpful to know, I think, right?
That's great. Go ahead, what was
I
it?
think the word guidelines because the one bedroom units are the problem child. And it would be nice if we didn't have many, but I think there was a formula on that, so we have to do a mix.
Mhm.
That would be helpful to know, just as we consider these potential sites.
Okay, I've got that down.
Thank you.
All right, so then moving on to the next item, item 5 on our agenda is review of the GIS data. So as I already indicated at the beginning, I've worked with Ty and Bond, which is the town's consultant that handles our GIS data and produces maps for us to start to try and identify at a broad level, properties we might be looking at. So let's start with the map, which Bob has kindly put up on the screen, just so I can explain to you what you're looking at here, and then we'll go over to the spreadsheet and talk about how we want to proceed from here.
Can I ask this really,
I think just leave it like that for now. If we start talking about an area, we may need to zoom in, but.
can I ask a really elementary question? What
Yeah.
is GIS?
Oh, GIS stands for Geographic Information Systems, and it's a software. I mean, have you ever heard of CAD that like engineers use to draw things up? So GIS is like that, except it's all these layers that you can put on a map. So you can overlay wetlands on top of property boundaries, on top of sewer area, and start to see how things shake out. And so it's an actually very potent information
Yeah.
source.
So you can sort of filter and narrow the fields of quote unquote acceptable or buildable sites based on.
Yeah, and it helps
a
you,
shopping filter.
it helps you, yeah, and it helps you see things spatially, right? So
Yes.
like, obviously not the situation here, but if you wanted to look at crime in town and you were mostly interested in downtown, you could, see exactly what type of crime is happening there. So it's a very cool data source, and I've always really appreciated it in planning because it brings some facts and data to what often are otherwise opinionated conversations. Especially with something as potentially controversial as affordable housing, I wanted to keep it as data-driven as possible. So what we're looking at here with this map, the map and the spreadsheet go together, and I'll explain how that works in a minute. But this map is obviously the entire boundary of New Canaan. And what I asked Ty and Bond to do is to highlight for us town-owned property. Those are in pink and they're listed as municipal. State-owned property, those are shown in green. And then privately owned property that's over 5 acres. 5 acres was just a shot in the dark that I thought was a round number. We heard today at Canaan Parish that site I think is more like 5.5 acres with maybe an acre of wetland. So we could probably go smaller if none of this turns up any fruit. But that's where we started for now. And then the other thing that this map shows is any of those properties, the pink, the green, or the purple, that are highlighted with a black boundary. For instance, on the top left, there's, I think, one of the reservoirs over on the Stanford border that means that it's vacant. So you can easily single out vacant land versus built upon land. And so each of these parcels has a number on it, albeit on this map on the screen, they're tiny. If you zoom in on what I've shared with you, you'll be able to read them. And those numbers correspond to the spreadsheet. So, if you're looking at the map and you're like, hey, I don't know, property 191, which I'm pretty sure is the country club, looks like a great place, then you can go over to the spreadsheet and get some more data about it. This one's Waveney, number 51, so that's how this whole situation works. I had talked to them about clipping this so that you only see what's in the sewer district. We haven't gone that far yet. I don't know if, we want to make that decision tonight that that's what we're going to do, but the data on the spreadsheet does show you whether it's in the sewer district or not. So, even if you're looking at one, you're like, this is really great, but I'm not sure, is it in or is it out? You can go to the corresponding spreadsheet and see that information. So before I jump to the spreadsheet, does anyone, one other thing I just wanted to highlight, you can see it in the top right corner with the legend, but The GIS data identified 54 town-owned properties, 27 state-owned properties, and 213 privately owned properties over 5 acres. So that comes to a total, I think, of 294 properties or something like that that are on the spreadsheet, which even though that's a big number, I think we'll be able to weed. I think it's a number we can weed through, number one. And number two, I think we'll get it down pretty quickly from that high number. I just started going through it the other day, and like the number one on the list was the fire station across the street. Well, like pretty quickly, I think we can cross that. There's a lot of things like that on there that you're like, well, that's just a no.
And are
So
these private properties on the market, or are they just private
No.
properties that are 5 acres?
yeah,
Okay.
they're just private properties that are 5 acres. We had talked about at the last meeting, showing institutionally owned properties. There was not anything in the data that really lent itself to us being able to easily identify those. So that's kind of a data set that would require more work on our part it's not impossible. It's just going to require, some more work. I think, I was asking them, could we go to the assessor's office and ask for things that don't have to pay taxes? Like, would that be, there's probably ways to get to it. It just wasn't easily accessible for this meeting, but I thought this was a good enough start.
So for instance,
go
like
ahead.
51 and 52, I'm assuming 51 is Waveney and 52 is the mulch field, right? Or the mulch,
Let me,
all the way at the bottom by Lapham Road.
yeah, I'm pretty sure 52 is, yes, it's the mulch field. 48's the high school. 47 is, I don't know if it's whatever, it's town-owned property next to the high school that's got the trails on it.
Oh,
40,
it's probably that potential BOE site
Yeah.
that was rejected. It can only
Yeah.
be used for educational purposes and not unless there's a deed transfer. So it was deeded to
yeah,
so everybody thinks it's part of Waveney, but it's actually school property. It's actually
right.
BOE property.
Yeah.
Got it.
And so, those are the things that I think collectively, especially some of us that have been in and around the government for a while, may know some of this as we go through it. You'll just be like, oh, well, that's a no because, that's only for educational purposes, and we can start to narrow it down. Okay. Other questions on the map before I take us over to the spreadsheet?
No, but this is really interesting.
Yeah, it is.
All right, so Bob, if you could bring up the spreadsheet next, I'll just walk you through how that works. I tried to print this on my 8.5 by 11 printer and it was illegible. So, for future meetings, I think we can get it printed probably on 11 by 17 and all have a paper that we're looking at to start to go through, but wasn't able to get that done for this evening. All right, so if you can zoom in enough so that we can all read the titles on the top, the column labels, I think that'll be enough for now. All right, so on the left side, you see the column listed as ID, and that corresponds to the numbers on the map. So that's how you're going to make the connection between the map and this spreadsheet. Then there's data on the parcel ID, the street number, all identifying information. The size dash LGL, that must be the legal size of the properties. So that's starting to give you a sense of that's in acres. So that's the acreage of the piece of land you're looking at. And again, looking at the top of the list, some of these are tiny, like 0.02 acres probably can get crossed off the list right out of the get-go. So that's what that means. We basically, water, I think, is empty. We can populate that column, but sewer service is probably the more narrow category that we're going to look at. I think pretty much everything that's on sewer is on public water. So the watered area of the town is greater than the sewered area. So sewer is more restrictive is what I'm trying to say. So anything in the sewer column that says public means that it's on public sewer and water. Anything that's blank is not on public sewer and water. Again, we could make a hard decision. We don't want to look at things that aren't on public sewer and water and eliminate a lot of them. By my count, quickly, there were 43 parcels of the 294 that are on public sewer and water. So, that cuts out a big chunk right away. I'm not sure if we're ready to go there, but just so you have an idea. I don't know what some of these next categories are when you skip through those and
That's the equality ID, it's the plot, the.
yeah, the map.
The map, plot.
Yeah.
The third.
That's how you'd find it if you went to the town clerk's office to look in their mapping system. The column labeled type, as you can see, lists state, municipal, and then there's got to be, yeah, there's a whole bunch at the bottom that say private greater than 5 acres. So that corresponds to the colors you saw on the map, and that's how they were colored. We have not populated the zoning. Whether there's a building on the property or not, that column's blank. Electric, gas is blank. Deed easement is not something that we'll get through GIS data. Probably as we get further along in this process, we'll have to look into that ourselves and populate that.
Is that to see if somebody has an easement on?
Yeah, to
It's
see what
planned,
easements
okay.
exist on them, because for instance, you brought up the mulch field, the leaf pile, like that one has an easement, the BOE site has an easement, so. Particularly on the town-owned land, you know, land that was donated was often donated for a specific purpose and becomes challenging to use for anything other than that purpose. So that's why eventually we'll want to populate that column, but it wasn't something, again, easily to come by for this meeting. What I do want to point out to you, the next couple of columns, wetlands and flood zone, those two. You'll see 0 and 1. Now this kind of gets into like technical coding stuff, but it's not that technical. So if you just hang with me for a minute, zeros mean no and 1 means yes. It's pretty simple. So with wetlands and flood zone, if it has a 0, there's no wetlands on it. If it has a 0 for flood zone, there's no flood zone on it. If it has a 1, then it means yes, it does have a wetland or it does have a flood zone. So that's what that means. Transit is still blank, but I kind of have a proxy for that. Parks, schools, and town center, those 3 columns, again, use the 0 and 1. What she did here was I asked her to use a 1/4 mile buffer, so 0.25 a mile. That's generally in planning what we consider to be walkable. A lot of places will also go up to a 1/2 mile, so 1/4 mile, 1/2 mile is sort of a maximum walking distance that we consider. So in the park, school, and town center column, anything with a 0 is more than 1/2 a mile from those items. So for instance, you know, quite a few of the things up in the park category are more than 1/2 mile, and then you hit something that has a 1, that's a property that's within a 1/2 mile of a park. Same goes for school. That same one that's within a 1/2 mile of the park is also within a 1/2 mile of a school. And then the same goes for town center. So anything that's within a walking, 1/2 mile walking distance of 1/4 mile walking distance of downtown, being Elm Street from Park to Main. She did a 1/4 mile buffer, sorry, I keep saying 1/2 mile, around that. And so anything that has a 1 there is at least theoretically walkable to downtown. There's other ways you can measure that. I mean, obviously, if there was like a highway around downtown, that 1/4 mile buffer doesn't really mean a lot because you've got a huge barrier that you can't cross. I don't think we have train tracks. There are some barriers you can't cross in downtown, but just hypothetically speaking, all of that should be walkable. And then what she attempted to do, I don't think this quite works for us yet, is the sum category is kind of adding up how many, points each property gets, subtracting for floods and wetlands and adding for park, schools, and town center. And that kind of gives you your overall scores, 0 or negative or positive. Again, I think we're too early to really rely too much on that, but that's what that means. And then the property use was some additional information from the assessor's office on how the piece of land is currently being used. All right, so what do we do with this? Yes.
Did we scroll, because a lot of that is state municipal land and its use is
Residential vacant land. I don't know why it says residential. It's probably just the zoning of the area that it's in. It's probably a reflection of the zoning. It's how the tax assessor is considering it. So it's not exactly. Oh, Paul Stone says he can't hear. Can everyone turn on their microphones?
Jeff, that might have been your question.
So yeah, you can, I think you can probably leave the microphones on. It doesn't seem like we're
Okay.
gonna have a lot of feedback in the room tonight, so just so that you don't have to keep turning them on and off.
And this is again, a pretty elementary question, but like Canaan Parish and Millport are zoned for residential, right? Is there like a residential high density zoning that you would have to qualify for, or would we want to look at primarily residential so that there isn't a variance that's needed? You know, like how is that zoned? What is the zone for?
So so to answer your question, Canaan
Yeah.
Parish and Millport each have a specialized zoning district that applies to their site that allows that type of development to be built there. So they don't fall under like the 1 acre zone or the 2 acre zone. There is a specific Millport zone, there is a specific Canaan Parish zone. We will eventually populate the zoning category there. For this process, I wouldn't worry too much about it. I think if the town identifies a site that they want to build on, there will have to be zoning changed to make that possible. So I wouldn't spend too much time freaking out about that.
Yeah, whether, even if it's a business zone, there'd be a whole new overlay zone that would be
Right.
placed on it that would have to pass muster with planning and zoning commission, I would think. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I was just curious how high density buildings like that
Yeah.
are
And I mean, there
covered
isn't,
under the zoning regulations.
there is not currently, I kind of wish we had like an affordable housing overlay zone or something where the town had already identified areas of town where this type of development would be desired or appropriate. We don't have that. That may be something that happens down the road, but for now, I wouldn't, lose too much sleep over it. I mean, the main thing is if something's like in the 4 acre zone, you're already gonna see that it doesn't have water or sewer. So it's gonna get probably ruled out anyway for those reasons, in addition to the fact that, that's our least populated zone, so.
All right.
So in terms of how do we use this and what do we do with it? What I was thinking could be a good process going forward to circle back to it, a future meeting would be if each of us spent some time between now and whenever our next meeting is going through this spreadsheet with the corresponding map. I can have a larger map printed if that's helpful, or if you just want to do it on the computer, that's probably the easiest way to do it. And what I was going to do is, for myself, was to add a column after property use that just was kind of like Krista's notes, and like, this is the fire station, this is, something else, and just kind of start to make notes about which ones might have potential for further comment.
Qualitative assessments.
Yeah,
Unofficial qualitative assessment.
correct. So I think if we each did that, then we could reconvene, or you guys could even send that stuff to me before a meeting and I could, highlight and say seven, there's not 7 of us. 3 people thought that this piece of property was good. 2 people like, so that we could kind of show the ones that sort of raised to the top. That being said, for a public process, I'd also want us to eventually come up with some evaluation criteria. It's kind of hard to do that though, without looking at this first. I suspect as you go through it, the evaluation criteria is going to become clear to you. We'll rule out the fire station across the street because it's too small a parcel and already has an existing public use on, and those other type of criteria, but it's almost, you kind of have to backdoor it a little bit. You have to see what's there, what works and what doesn't work before you can clearly say, here's the criteria we're using. So I thought that for the next meeting, if we each went through and did our own sort of subjective analysis, that then we could come back together and put it together and see, what are we all then actually saying about what makes a good parcel and what doesn't.
Makes sense.
I think
Does
that's
make sense.
a great idea.
I
Is
think
this
Scott has his hand up, by the way.
is
Okay.
this, just quickly, is this a editable Excel spreadsheet that we can go on if we wanted to add a column and put our comments in?
Yes, I
And
believe I
then-
sent it to you guys as an Excel spreadsheet. So
great.
you should be able to add columns, but if you have any trouble, let me know. And then we'll talk about this when we talk about next steps, but I think it would be really beneficial if we set a deadline of when to get feedback to me, and then I can come to the next meeting with that sort of collective data, as opposed to us each having to go around being like, what do you think about number 1?
Yeah.
What do you think about
Yeah.
number 2? I think it'll be a faster way to go through it. Okay. Does Scott still have his hand raised? Scott Hobbs?
Yeah.
Yes,
Oh.
so quick question. So I think this stuff gets very useful. I wasn't sure exactly on the spreadsheet, obviously not having quite control over it. Do you have for commercial or sorry, for anything that is on sewer and water? I think 5 acres is probably too much to be looking at. I mean, are we
Right.
looking at much smaller also, or?
So I think we could. I mean, this was kind of my first stab at it. And
Mhm.
that's another question I wanted to leave here with feedback on tonight is, are there additional data points or properties we want to add into this? I mean, I can go back to Ty and Bond and say, if it's on sewer and water, we want to look at things, I don't know, 2 acres or less. I'm just throwing out numbers. Or, gee, we really wanted information on, I don't know, who pays taxes and who doesn't, I could go back and try and get more information as well.
And this is what's the size parcel over at the Red Cross?
Oh,
Is that it?
0.3, isn't that right?
It's pretty small. Yeah.
I think it's like
0.3.
0.3 or 0.4 acres.
Yeah.
And we've seen a plan with how many units on that?
20 something.
plus.
Yeah.
20 plus.
Maybe 25.
Yeah, so and that just raises that issue under both an offense and a defense question. Like if we only need 15 points, then if we only I see Paul saying 20, but if we only need 15 points, then a third of an acre might be able to be enough in order to get us a 10 unit development. In addition, if somebody can put 20 on a third of an acre, it'd be good if we actually took a look at some of those properties and said, actually over here, that might be okay. Or over in these areas, oh my goodness, that would just be a total disaster. And again, I know that all of a sudden you very quickly say well, everything on sewer and water meets that criteria. So it's not necessarily helpful. And so I do think we need some parameters, but 5, I feel 5 is definitely too big. Maybe even starting with 1.5 or 2 acres or something for on sewer and water. And then we probably want to work our way down eventually into much smaller ones. But again, there's a limit of time and focus. So I fully get that.
No, I think that's useful feedback.
What is
John?
focus for?
Oh, let me look at my map and correspond it to the table and I'll get back to you on that.
Which locust? What's on
The Locust parking lot.
Oh.
Just as to Scott's
Yeah.
point, an example.
All right, so Locust is number 27 on the map. And so on the spreadsheet,
Just two lines.
it's 1.32 acres.
And there was a question, I think, when it was floated as a possible police department site of buying the 2 houses, I think on Forest, right?
Forest.
To make for another entrance or exit. So if we were to consider that, that might be something we would also have to consider. So to Scott's point, that's the kind of data too that might be helpful of those 2 properties, what they're sort of assessed at value wise, because we
Right.
would probably have to add that into any expense.
So, I mean, another metric I've used personally in the past when doing stuff with GIS is properties where the assessed value for the property is greater than the building value. Am I saying that right? That the land is worth more than the building. And you can figure that out usually from looking at the assessor's data. And I've always used that. Now, granted, I was working in a very different market and environment where there was a lot of properties where the land was worth more than the building, as sort of a marker of a property that might be ripe for redevelopment. I mean, if your building is worth less,
Katrina.
yeah, post Katrina in New Orleans, there was a lot of land worth more than the buildings that were on them.
I'm sorry, it's just.
I don't know if that works here.
Think about where was that? I knew you were in New Orleans.
But I mean, I don't know if that would even exist in New Canaan, but if it actually did, if you had properties where the land was worth more than the building on it, I would say then those are definitely ripe for redevelopment because, no one's probably going to rehab that building if they could build something new on that same piece of land that's worth more.
What about the whole issue of sewer and water and how far into this process do we decide or not decide or, give it extra weight as a criterion? I mean, it seems as if there's an assumption in some people's minds that we should start by looking at properties that already have sewer and water. I'm assuming that's because of time and money. But how do we weigh that versus other factors? And when, do we need more information about that? Or do you all have all the information you need about how that impacts the project?
I mean, my guess is that we're going to end up with something that's on sewer and water. That being said, I haven't studied this enough to be able to say right now, oh, there's nothing outside of the sewer and water and district that could be great. I mean, honestly, I've often thought a lot about Talmadge Hill, which is not on sewer and water, is on transit, you know, not walking distance to downtown, but a short train trip. So those are the ones that give me pause to
Yeah.
say, oh, we should just rule those out completely, because there may be something like that through this process, and it may not end up being the winner, but it may be something we should consider. So I
Okay.
just feel like for me, it's a little too early.
Yeah.
There's no doubt, almost no doubt in my mind that that's where we'll end, but I just don't know if we go there yet.
You'd have to look at like a community septic type of through the state.
Right.
I'm not familiar how they work, maybe other people know how they work, but it's, you know, an omnibus system that, you know, is for the entire, all the units, you know, in the building. I think you have to go through the state to do one of
I
that.
think, yes, or the town has to extend the
Sewer and water.
sewer or water.
Yeah.
If that's
If it's not
possible,
feasible.
right? It may not be feasible for every piece of land, but,
It might, yeah, I mean, I think to your point, something like Talmadge Hill is an interesting one because how far is it from Waveney's on town sewer and water?
Waveney's on town sewer and water.
So, you know, it's like the mulch pile isn't, but that would seem to be, I mean, it would be an added expense because it's something like $1 million a mile, or I think to extend sewer is what Tiger's told me before at least. But,
Oh.
you know, we can build something like that. Do you know, Scott?
There's also an issue that there's the deed restrictions on any property that's near the Merritt. So you can't actually build something high within a certain number of feet from the Merritt Parkway.
Oh, good to know. I had no idea about that.
Okay.
Mulch lot is deed
And
restricted
it-
also.
Yeah.
You know, Scott's points are good on the size of property, particularly in town. Because I'm thinking about Burtis when you brought Burtis up. I'm not sure how big that plot is, but it's not that big.
No, it's
And-
smaller than an acre, I would
And
think.
there's 26 units on it. And my recollection is that they didn't bust height. They might have gone a little bit higher, but it wasn't
Right.
like they went up to 60 feet.
No,
you
I
know,
think
with
they
the
might have
tower.
gone to 35 or 40.
And
So
there's commercial in the first
there's
place.
commercial on it, and I'm not sure on the size of the units, so you might even been able to get more units in this plot that size, but you know, again, we have so many variables here, and to John's point, we have the other variable about whether we wanted to go 100%
Mhm.
affordable, which would
Mhm.
reduce it. So if you had a smaller project, would you do it all affordable or not? But yeah, I think we'll have to look at the smaller properties, you know, and
Okay.
within the town sewer and water.
Okay. Do we want to come up with a number? Or do you want me to work with the GIS consultant to try and figure out, you know,
You mean
under,
size?
yeah, size wise, under an acre and under,
I might like to see everything on town sewer, like anything within that sort of magic circle.
okay.
Particularly, and maybe we can prioritize ones that are municipal or state-owned, and then anything on the market currently, and then residential might be helpful, just so we have an idea, like,
Okay.
because I can't imagine us sticking like letters in people's mailboxes.
Yeah, you might be able to mix and match. You might be able to find
Right.
2 1-acre
Yeah.
parcels where you could squeeze in 30 units on each.
Absolutely. I think that would be helpful. Would that be helpful?
Yeah.
The on the market piece, obviously that changes
Constantly.
day
Yep,
by
yep.
day. I mean, I would think that there's a real estate agent in town or someone that could give me a spit out of the addresses
Mhm.
and I could have the GIS person map it, but it would be dated as of the date that
Sure.
that report was made for us.
And now's probably not the best time because people who are shopping for houses are shopping now. Like, I think this is the
The
boom
hot,
time of the
yeah.
market. Maybe in the fall, once school has started, it starts to quiet down a little bit because the people who want to move here might want to enroll their kids in school, blah, blah. So there might be a date at which we look at on the market, but even if we don't do that now, I do think looking at the property within that sort of magic circle is, would be good.
Does that include commercial? Yeah. Good question.
I think it should. I
Probably,
mean,
I
everything
think
I
so.
heard today
Yeah.
at the Canaan Parish walkthrough was that, downtown adaptive reuse of commercial.
Yeah, I think all the business zones should be included, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so that I think would be like almost a separate spreadsheet. This is kind of like the whole town, and then we'll have a separate spreadsheet that's sewer and water area properties.
I think for our purposes and our timing, it makes sense to limit it to what's already currently on sewer and water, because I think that just adds a whole level of complexity trying to do that privately, like with a well or a private septic that.
Well, and I
Or
also,
maybe not.
no, I think it does. And, as I think we've talked about, number one, we don't know if we have one project or multiple projects. Even if we only have one project for a 2028 moratorium, there's going to have to be future moratoriums. So I don't think our time is wasted necessarily looking at things outside the sewer and water district. They're probably not going to be the first priority. But to have a short list for future consideration so that every 4 years we don't have to do this process again, right, may be worth the time. Okay, so what I'm hearing,
Has his hand up.
Mr. Goodwin, come to the microphone.
Krista, did you say though you're not capturing institutional uses?
Well, so they're not on here. I just haven't been able to identify them. So I'm
Oh,
like,
okay.
I'm pretty
But
sure.
they are on there.
Yeah, I'm pretty
Oh.
sure going back to the map that like Grace Farms is on there because it's a parcel greater than 5 acres that's privately owned. I just haven't been able to highlight it and say this one's institutional. I mean, you and I know them sort of in our heads, but like there isn't a column on the spreadsheet that identifies them as such. Okay. So in terms of next step, I think everyone was in favor of going through what we have here and whittling down the list and sending me, a list or a printout of your spreadsheet or however you want to do it of the ones that you think are good options. And as you do that, like I said, start thinking about what the sort of overarching criteria are that you're using, even though you may not know it yet. I think it'll become clear as you go through the process. And well, we haven't set a next meeting date, but I'll ask you guys to get me that stuff before our next meeting date. And then I will go back to Ty and Bond.
Hey, Lisa. Things aren't going well.
You mute, Scott. I will go back to Ty and Bond and ask them to give us similar data for all the parcels that are within the sewer area of town, regardless of size, with no size cap. It's probably going to be a much longer list, right? I have no idea, but I'm sure it's going to be more than 294 parcels that are in the sewer area of town. And so I can bring that or get it to you before the next meeting.
Are these organized too? I mean, it looks like they're organized to streets, so you have everything on Ponus together, everything on Bowery. And I'm guessing that's a better way to sort it than sorting it by largest parcel to smallest, because
So
that could separate out contiguous.
Because it's in Excel, you can sort it anyway. You see the little drop down arrows
Yeah.
and the dark green at the top. You can sort it by any of those. So if you only wanted to see things that were within a 1/4 mile of town center, you just sort it so that only the ones show up.
Got it.
And so that's another way to play with this when you're looking at it, is you don't necessarily have to go through them one by one. If in your mind, we're not looking at anything that's off of sewer and water, then just go to the column that's sewer
Yep.
and click that you only want to see the ones that say public. And there you go. Now you only have to look at 49 and not 294. Make your homework easy.
Got it.
So yeah, you can sort it however you want. You could, sort it by size, you could sort it by address. I think right now, the order it's in is based on those ID numbers on the far left column. And that's just so you could easily find them to correspond to the map.
Yep.
But beyond that,
Great. Okay.
any other questions on this? I apologize that it's technical. I've tried to make it simple, but I know it's not quite simple.
Done a lot since we last met.
Yes, very good data.
All right. Well, then let's take some public comment if we have any, and then we'll talk about next steps, where we want to go. I see Mr. Landy's in the room and has his hand up. So come on up and just make sure you hit the button on the microphone so that people on Zoom can hear you.
Giacomo Londi, Elm Street, New Canaan. First, it was great to be here in person. I've only had the chance to see this by video, so good to see real faces. To the New Canaan Affordable Housing Committee, thank you for your service to the town of New Canaan and its residents. The work we can see being done by your committee is excellent, and we encourage you to keep it up. You can see the work done tonight, combined with excellent data we have in town is really good. What we can infer from both the proposed and existing legislation at the state level, and it appears also plans at the town level, is that residents of New Canaan should expect a good deal of proposed rezoning and proposed multifamily construction projects throughout New Canaan over the coming decades. If I understood the numbers correctly, we're looking at 75 to 100 830G classified affordable units being built every 4 years for approximately 3 decades to reach the 10% 830G mandate. If done by private developers using 830G legislation, that is between 250 and 330 total new housing units in town every 4 years, or around 1% annual growth in our total housing stock, resulting in 4 to 5 decades of construction to reach the state mandate. To accommodate the potential profits associated with these state mandates, land and homes will transfer from single families, as more than 80% of New Canaan households appear to be owner occupied, to professional developers and investors or the town of New Canaan. We know that rezoning and subsequent densification of property use creates enormous value for the parties who are successful at doing this, either private or municipal entities. As budding property owners to such a proposed development, it has also been made clear to us that we either need to get some very good lawyers or just deal with it, and perhaps both. The challenge for you as potential developers of such projects is how to ensure that neighbors of the properties you are looking to redevelop don't end up dealing with the same issues we are. I encourage you to work with planning and zoning and town government to educate the public about how we will actually manage neighborhood development and single-family housing in these new zoning realities where large-scale spot zoning projects, either proposed by private developers or the town, becomes the norm. My sense, after thinking about this for some time, is that part of this town plan will need to include rezoning abutting neighbors to the same proposed development density of these new projects. This is the only practical, fair, and equitable way to deal with the economic mismatch created by such proposed extreme differences in zoning. Such a leveling of the playing field between professional developers, investors, and the town on one side, and individual families on the other, will provide some compensation to abutting homeowners to mitigate the cost of these changes and will come at essentially no cost burden to the town. This would have the added benefit of creating new clusters of housing on similar and larger geographic footprints so that existing neighborhood aesthetics can be better considered and incorporated into plans, rather than the mismatch which is presently coming our way. Lastly, this will accelerate achievements of the objectives of these state mandates, which are driving this rezoning in the first place. Thank you.
Giacomo, would you mind emailing that to us so that we have your?
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Do we have anybody else on Zoom that wants to give public comment this evening? Okay. All right, well then let's move on to next steps and a future meeting date. So what did we did about, I think, 4 weeks last time, which would put us towards the end of May.
Yeah, 2 weeks after the full committee meeting.
Full committee meeting in May is on May 13th. 15th?
That was to be Memorial Day, no, 13th.
13th, okay. So Monday, the 27th would be 2 weeks after that, and that is Memorial Day.
That's
Right.
Memorial Day weekend.
We don't always have to do Mondays, though we can. So we could skip to June 3rd if we want to stick with Mondays, or we can look at something else the week of the 27th if we want to move quicker.
I can do the 3rd.
Yeah, I can do the 3rd as well.
I can do the 3rd as well.
Me too.
All right, then let's get that on there.
Krista, that's a pain for me because that's when the finance subcommittee meets on the 3rd.
Oh,
Oh, okay.
I don't want to suggest that since I'm not even an official member, I don't want to suggest that it should twist it around for that, but
probably be hard for John. too.
Yeah, that's good to know.
What about another day, the week of Memorial Day, or are people all away?
So I think I have planning and zoning on Tuesday, the 28th. So that day is out for me, but I could do Thursday, the 30th.
Well, one, you're saying that's the night of the finance. One of the things you could do is you could do
Yeah,
the finance at 6.
Right.
Project at 7.
that's true. And then that kind of works for everyone. Maybe that's what we,
They've already scheduled their meeting for 7.
6. All right, well then maybe
Well,
let's,
you're right, they have already done, but
so
we've
what,
got a representative right here.
so what time is it?
Are you changing it?
Busy
Jeff, do you know what time it is?
yes,
The- It's at 7. All right. Could people in this committee meet at 6 or 5
On which day again?
on June 3rd?
3rd.
I could do 6. 5 might be tough.
Okay.
Is that enough time?
I mean, I don't know that we'll finish in an hour because we haven't finished in an hour yet, but it does at least give people the opportunity to come for some of it and then go to the next one. So I
Thank you.
think it's
Yeah,
better
good
than
idea.
complete overlap.
6 o'clock on the 3rd, we're thinking?
Yes. All right, so then working backwards from that.
I can't believe we're already scheduling into June.
I know.
That's, sorry.
Do you guys think you could give me feedback on the spreadsheet we talked about tonight by the Friday before Memorial Day weekend, the 24th of May?
Sure.
That would give me a week to try and pull it together. And I'll send you a reminder just in case you forget, but that's. And one thing I forgot to mention when we were talking about the spreadsheet earlier, I know after the last meeting, Hillary circulated to at least everyone on this committee, if not to the larger Affordable Housing Committee, this New Canaan Police Facility Site Selection Report that was shared. And I guess I wanted to get your thoughts on it. When I look at this, my thoughts are if we could come out with a report like this, that, Affordable Housing Site Selection Committee, this is kind of the ideal scenario of what we're heading towards. Obviously, we're going to need some help doing that down the road, but in my mind, this is kind of the product that I see this committee coming out with. I don't know if you guys agree or disagree or what, but that's at least what I was going towards. And I was also going to say that using this, and then I also have the Town of New Canaan Building Evaluation and Use Committee's Comprehensive Building Review Report. Not sure how I stumbled into having this, but it's from 2017 and it goes through all the town buildings. And it also does, I think, have some vacant property in here. Anyway, these two things could be useful in going through that spreadsheet. If you're like, well, what is this parcel? Like, you probably can cross correlate it to one of these two things. So I'll recirculate these after the meeting so that you guys have them to go through as well. Let me see if there's anything else in my notes. Okay, so this all sounds good. So we'll have our next meeting on June 3rd at 6 PM before the finance subcommittee starts. I will hopefully be able to get a room, but I'll let you know if that becomes a problem. I'll get feedback from everybody by May 24th on the spreadsheet so that I can try and put that together and see where some of the more interesting parcels are for the group. And I will follow up with Ty and Bond to get us some additional data on parcels that are all within the sewer and water district. Does that sound good?
Very good.
All right, shall we adjourn?
So move.
All right, thank you. Thank you, everybody, for attending.